Welcome back. I am here with Gloria Mark. Gloria, I love your work. We were just talking really quick beforehand about how much of an impact it's had on me personally, just on helping me focus and get back into what I'm working on in the time. And we this all came about because we share a literary agent and the amazing Jodri. And I asked her, I said, you know what, we don't have to have anybody else for this, but can you think of anybody that you work with that you think would be perfect? And she gave me 4 or 5 names, and you were the one that popped out when I started looking into your work because of your work in, am I going to pronounce this right? Informatics.
That's right. That's right.
That's right. And so that is the intersection between what? Technology
And people, human beings.
and human beings. How did you get into this? Your background is painting.
I did start out as an artist and never thought I would be doing anything else. And love doing art. Would get into flow very often, and we can talk about that later if you want. But there came a point where I realized that before you can really make it as an artist, so that you're just solely living on your income as an artist, you pretty much have to do other day jobs. And I realized that there are a lot of other things I really love doing besides art. I didn't want to do a day job that I didn't like to support something that I liked. So I realized, I also liked things like math and science, and started, dabbling around, looking at classes in that. Before I know it, I got into a graduate program in psychology, because psychology is a really nice mix of, it has the science aspect, but it's also about trying to understand human nature. And I was really interested in that.
Yeah.
And I would say, as an artist, I was also in pursuit of trying to capture and portray human nature. So it ended up being a really nice mix. Now, from psychology, how did I get into tech? Well, it actually came about from my own personal experience of using tech at the rise of the digital age, like in the early 2000s. The web started coming about into widespread popularity in the mid-1990s. Before that, it wasn't used so often. I had used it, but most people hadn't. But I realized that I was starting to get more and more glued to my computer, and at the same time was having a hard time just staying focused on any particular screen. I was thrashing around. And so I began to wonder, to what extent is it just me, or do other people experience this as well? And so I'm an empiricist. I can study this, and I did, and I found out it was pretty widespread. And this is a real phenomenon. And I decided, wow, I really want to understand this. I want to know what's going on. Like, why do people have such excessive use of technology? It's even gotten worse. It's getting worse over the years. And why are people reporting and being so distracted? So that's how I got into this.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating. One of the things that jumped out to me that I love so much about your work, but more so like your approach to your work, is the intersection between the arts and the technology. And I find a lot of the research into the tech, even the addictive natures of it. I mean, we've all read those books and some of the studies, but there's always this, okay, but it's humans that are using this thing, and we can't really, I mean, unless we run away to a forest and live in the middle of nowhere, which sometimes sounds appealing, but but we can't do that in most of our lives. And so we're going to have to use these things, and we're human. So where is that intersection? And I think your background really lends to that. So I do want to talk about that a fair bit, but I'm going to throw two numbers at you, and I
Okay.
think you'll know what they are once I throw them at you.
Probably.
The
Got it.
first one is the first one's 25 minutes and 20 seconds, 27 seconds,
Yeah.
and the second one is 2.26. What do
Okay.
those two numbers mean to you?
Right. So, and let me, before I answer this, let me say that there are even worse numbers than that, which I think you'll get to.
Ooh,
So if
hang on, folks. We're going to get to the worse numbers than these.
so if if you look at people's work in terms of tasks, so as an academic, there's a lot of different tasks I have. For example, I might write a paper, and if I'm writing a paper, I might switch maybe from reading an article to writing. Maybe I might, you know, text someone about the paper, but I'm working on the same project.
Yeah,
Okay. So the first number that you pointed out, roughly 25 and a half minutes, is how long it takes if people are interrupted from some task, how long it takes for them to get back to work on that task. So we might think, yeah,
crazy,
we're
crazy.
interrupted, we work on something, and then we come right back. That's not the pattern of how it works. The pattern is that we switch away from a task. We work on another task. We switch from that. We start working on something else. Start to switch to something else, and then go back to the first task. That's the 2 point, basically 2.25 other tasks. There's two and a
Yeah,
quarter intervening tasks that we work on if we're interrupted from a task. Now, what does that mean for our productivity, for our, our exhaustion? It means that we're making a switch to something else. We've got cognitive resources, and we're using those resources to apply to a different task. Then we're switching again, and we're using
yeah,
those precious and limited resources to something else. And it takes time to reorient to a new task. Then we start to work on something else and then go back and try to recoup where we left off. And we're expending those very precious resources to try to figure out, like, where were we? What were we doing? We might have to do some redundant work to try to, figure this out. If I'm writing, I may have to reread part of what I wrote to get back into that frame of
yeah.
mind of working on that project. That's lost time, and we have a lot of lost time. It's called a switch cost. We have a lot of that throughout the day.
I think about I think about the most obvious example in my life right now. I have a 6 year old and a 1 year old.
Oh, yeah.
And the most obvious example is trying to read a book and how many times I read the same sentence over and over and over and over again. But this idea of so often I find myself, I don't know about anybody else, but I find myself exhausted at the end of the day. And then I look down and I'm like, what the heck did I accomplish? I've been doing stuff. I don't even know if you were to ask me what I did, I don't even know what it was. And yet the day's gone, which if you think about like an 8 hour day, I mean, sit on an airplane with a 6 year old for 8 hours going to, going to Europe, going to England or something like that. You tell me how long 8 hours is. It's a long time. There's a lot of hours in a day to work. I want to get into the mental schemas a lot because I think that that's so fascinating. But before we do, can you talk a little bit about external versus internal interruptions? And I'm curious whether they are different in terms of how long it takes us to return back to a task, whether somebody else interrupts us or whether our own little monkey brains cause us to jump to something else.
Yeah. So you're right. There are, everyone tends to think of distractions and interruptions as something external to us, right? There's a text notification, we hear a chime, we see a flashing notification on our screen. And by the way, having a 1-year-old and a 6-year-old, those are wonderful sources of distraction. So I hope
They are.
that
They're the best distractions in the world.
they're, and I really hope when they distract you that you're giving them attention, because that's just a wonderful source. But anyways, so there are a lot of things in our environment, and there is this myth that our distractions are solely caused due to notifications and algorithms,
Yeah.
right? Algorithms which uh, tech companies use to try to understand your digital behavior, to be able to infer what your interests are, what kind of information you might respond to, and so on. It's a lot more than that. But it turns out that
Yeah.
nearly half the time we tend to interrupt ourselves. And it's the most uncanny thing if I'm observing someone and I'm watching them, they're doing work, and then for no apparent reason they suddenly stop what they're doing and they pick up the phone. They suddenly switch to email or switch to social media. And there's no discernible external stimulus that's causing them to switch. What's going on?
Nothing
There's
that you could. Nothing in any of the studies that you've seen. There's no patterns that you've been able to identify.
no, it's from within people. So it's,
Wow. Okay.
and we've asked people, what's going on, and it's usually it's a memory that they forgot to do something. It's an urge. You have an urge to check the news because you're pretty sure something is going on. Of course, fear of missing out. So there's a lot of different reasons, and of course, a big reason is what's called the Zeigarnik effect. And the Zeigarnik
Okay.
effect means that we tend to remember interrupted tasks. We remember those way better than tasks that are completed. Why? Because if you complete a task,
Oh.
it's off your plate. You're finished. You're through it. You check it off. It's done. But a task that's not completed, we keep rehearsing over and over in our minds because we don't want to forget
Yep.
that task. And it creates tension. And no one
Yeah.
wants to experience tension. And so you keep thinking of this interrupted task. And so you have this urge to interrupt and go back and finish it. And as a result, our days are very often comprised of just a whole slew of interrupted tasks. Even starting to read the news and moving away from the news, that's an interrupted task. You haven't finished reading the news. So we do a lot of that during the day.
And what strikes me is that we can control, or there's often tech that's created to control external interruptions. Focus mode on Apple devices and things like that, where, the tech giants come out and they're holier than thou and they say, oh my God, look at what we're doing to solve this problem. The problem largely is within, isn't it? The idea of, it was funny because I was going to ask you about it, and then I was like, I don't know how to pronounce it. Zygo, what
Zeigarnik.
was it?
Zeigarnik.
Zygarnik.
Yes.
And the idea with the Zygarnik effect, it's similar. I think about it with writing and advertising and copywriting, where a lot of what you often try to do is create an open loop, is establish tension to be able to pull the reader along or get somebody to watch the next episode of the serialized TV show. Is it the same effect then? The same
Um,
core effect, I guess?
I think it's a little bit different because the Zeigarnik effect, it's related to a task that you've done. So you have some investment in the task. You've put some
Okay.
thought into it, you've put some work into it. Let me mention that Bluma Zygarnik was quite unusual. She did this study over 100 years ago, and she was really one of the
Yeah.
first women psychologists. And she did. It's a beautiful study. She was at University of Berlin, and it's
Hmm.
she did a really nice job showing this to be the case, that people remember unfinished tasks.
It's amazing. It's amazing when you hear stories about. I have no idea how to even begin to connect with it, and I've tried to read accounts. I mean, the most notable one right now is this book that's a mega bestseller, Lessons in Chemistry, that tries to chronicle a fictional character, but her experience as a scientist in the 1950s and just what she went through trying to establish a career as a scientist in the 1950s. It even makes it more impressive, isn't it? You cannot even imagine how much misogyny and how many barriers she went up against. Because psychology, in and of itself, is a very new study too. I was going to ask you about William James and who William James was, so maybe this is a nice segue to that.
Yeah. So William James is known as the father of psychology. And, people have talked about attention, philosophers have, but, he's really the first psychologist who's really talked about attention. He doesn't carefully define attention, but he says everyone knows what attention is. In other words, when we're focused on something, we're aware of it. We can experience that. And he talks about other kinds of attention, kind of like stream of consciousness as another kind of attention. But he really talks about this idea of focused attention. And he assumes that everyone has the power to be able to have focused attention whenever they want. That humans have this tremendous willpower to do so, and William James probably did, but it's not the case. This view of being focused and unfocused has changed since William James, which was
Yeah,
well over 100 years ago.
I was going to say he was the 1890s in and around there,
Yes,
wasn't
yes.
he? Yes. So then, what one of the counterintuitive things that you talk about a fair bit over and over in interviews, and I agree with this because I've seen it, but I've never been able to verbalize it myself, is how important it is to go in attention and then out of attention and almost, for lack of a better word, let your mind wander or do activities that don't require any skill or active thought to let your mind wander. I was going to ask you, I mean, how do we then get ourselves into this attention period and almost, I don't think we can stop, but almost control these internal interruptions that seem to be taking over at least my life?
Yeah, so in our research, we found that there are different kinds of attention. And so the way we measured this is we gave people what we call probes. These are, on their phones or
Okay.
computers, really quick questions that they had to answer. And they had to answer two questions. How engaged are you in the thing you were just doing? And how challenged were you? And so people, you can answer these in a couple of sentences. You basically clicked on his green click, click, and you're done. And I'm aware, of course, that we're interrupting people to answer these questions, but we were able to get really great data. And when people are really engaged and challenged, we call that a state of focus, right? Because if you're paying
Yeah.
attention, you have to exert a little bit of effort, right? If you're reading something, if you're listening to an audiobook or a podcast, you have to exert some effort to try to understand. But when people are engaged in something and not at all challenged, they're doing something really easy. We call that a rote attention, or they're doing a rote activity. And
Right.
let me give you an example. Playing solitaire. You can be really engaged in playing solitaire, but it's easy. You're not really expending much
Yeah.
effort. Watching a video, right, is, you know, can be a little bit mindless unless it's a video where you're trying to learn something, trying to learn about some new technology, then you become focused. So a lot of what we do during the day is switch between this kind of focused, attention and this rote attention. Now, if you're not engaged or challenged at all, we call that boredom. It's a state of being bored. You're just not challenged. You're not engaged. It's not necessarily a pleasant feeling, and we find that when people are bored, it tends to be associated with negative mood. And then if you're really challenged and you're just not engaged at all in doing something, we call that a state of frustration. Now, if I have a tech
Right.
problem, I'm just not engaged, but I'm kind of forced to have to solve it, and I'm challenged, and I just can't get my attention on it. That's a state of frustration. So we find that people switch between these different kinds of attention throughout the day. Now, earlier I talked about that people have this limited amount of cognitive resources, and
Hmm.
we spend them. Think about it as you have this tank, right? And it kind of drips depending on different things you do. Exactly. And that's why you're exhausted at the end of the
Yeah.
day, because your tank is empty. But when we focus, that actually uses attentional resources or cognitive resources. If we do something rote, like people who play Candy Crush, that's doesn't really use much
I like that
cognitive.
example in the book.
Yeah, doesn't use much
Yeah. A
cognitive
case a
resources
case for
at all.
for Candy Crush.
That's right.
Yeah.
The pro and and it's okay to do this kind of snacking on these easy, engaging activities. In fact, we find in our research people are actually happiest when they do these. They have a calming effect. The problem is when people
Hmm.
get stuck and they go down a rabbit hole and you can't get away from these activities. That's the problem, right? But, if you've got
Yeah.
10 minutes before a meeting and you just feel like you want to calm down, it's fine. It's fine to go ahead, play your favorite mindless game, calm yourself down, and then go to your meeting.
I wanna stick on that because that was one of the things I wanted to speak to you about was just how brilliant that simple example was of it's okay to play the games, it's okay to check social media. I mean, I don't think you can ever reasonably say to people, I just don't use it. Just don't do these things. Right?
Yeah.
But what you were able to say is, hey, if you can actually design it so that you have a defined end activity with a set time, then it seems to work really well. So the example you gave is exactly that. I just wanted to really pull that out and highlight it because I thought it was so brilliant. This is where I was talking to you before we started recording of like stuff that I started to do from your book and like take action on.
Mm.
And knowing that, okay, I've got a meeting or I've got an interview at whatever, 1:45 p.m. Okay, at 1:30, I'm going to check my Instagram messages, let's say. Knowing that at 1:42 p.m., I've got to go in and turn on my lights and plug in my mic. There's a set end time versus just, oh, I'll stop when I'm done because you're never done. These systems are designed to never be done.
That's
There's
right.
just, oh, let me just check what's happened in the world in the last 30 seconds and see if something said something interesting. Um, it's so simple,
It is. It is.
but it's a very good kind of black and white rule.
I call it a hook. Find a hook that can pull you out. Now, some people are very good at, defining a time, 10 minutes to take a snack on whatever your favorite rote activity is and then get back to work. But some people are not so
Yeah.
good. And if you're not so good, then find a hook that can pull you out. And that hook could be a meeting, do this activity before a meeting just to get your mind kind of calmed down and get yourself ready for it. Or, if you're in a doctor's office, you can do it because you're waiting anyways, and you're going to get called at some point. But find whatever hook that is, or even setting an alarm can be a hook that pulls you out.
I think a lot about what was his name? Halverson, her study that highlights the difference between the words "I don't" versus "I can't." It's now become a very famous study, but it's the difference between a rule that I set for myself versus something that some external whatever has come and said, you're allowed or not allowed to do these things. Because it seems like a lot of what you're getting at, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but is this idea of, in a sense, structure breeds freedom. These black and white rules are very important for most people. I mean, all humans are different, but for most people, and the better we can create these rules in our life, the better we're going to be able to navigate these kinds of tools. It's weird that all of these tools that are created to free up our time and make our lives easier, in a way, they absolutely have. I mean, I don't think you could ever argue against that, but they've also kind of forced a whole new set of forced constraints and skill sets, haven't they?
That's right. That's right. And it turns out, going back to the study I talked about, where people had to answer how engaged and how challenged they were, and of course we found different kinds of attention. It turns out that people have rhythms for when they are focused.
Okay.
People don't have extended focus over the entire day. Why? Because we have these limited cognitive resources. We just can't do it. We have to pull back at points and get replenished. And if you do have these long periods of extended focus, you exhaust yourself. People get exhausted. So it turns out that most people are pretty good at having these rhythms. So peak times of focus for most people is like there's one point mid to late morning, another point in the afternoon, like mid-afternoon. And it depends on a person's circadian rhythm. If you're an early type or a late type, of course, an early type, your attentional peak will be much earlier in the day. And so what you were talking about, these kinds of constraints, if people follow these apps that say, you're going to work X amount of time, and then you take a break, and another X amount of time and take a break. It's not necessarily mapping
Right.
onto an individual rhythm. And so it's much more productive for people to understand when their peak focus times are, and to do what I call designing your day. So you're not writing a list. If it's 11 o'clock, I want to finish this. By 12, I want to finish this. You're designing your work around what is optimal for you. And, if your optimal time is, you're at your best from like 10 a.m. to noon, do the hardest and most, the tasks that require the most creativity, do it during that period of time. And you will be at your best. And then, of course, you need to take a break and replenish.
Yeah. So protect those times. It sounds like is very important.
Protect
And
and use them wisely, right? You don't want to waste
yeah.
time when your attention is at its peak by doing some task like email, right? or
Right.
some remote activity, use it wisely.
One of my favorite authors in the world is Neil Gaiman, and for a number of reasons. But his work that he writes, but also how he's gone about his career, how many different things he's done in his career, I think are very interesting too. But one of his rules, the way that he writes, is he'll walk down to his little gazebo. He writes paper and pen, but you could do this with a computer. But he gives himself a choice. He can write or he cannot write. He's not allowed to do anything else. So he'll go down to his gazebo and he has 2 hours. 2 hours works for him. I found that 2 hours works for me too, but everybody's different.
Mm-hmm.
But he gives himself 2 hours and he's allowed to not write for those 2 hours. He's just not allowed to do anything else. And he, of course, says, after you sit and don't do anything for a while, writing becomes the best option. But there are certainly days where he sits there for 2 hours and he doesn't write for that entire time. And I love that. I mean, my background is fitness. And in fitness, we talk a lot about, obviously, systems-oriented tasks, process tasks versus goals, because the minute you hit a goal, the goal line changes anyway. But the best systems have leakage designed into the systems. You can't be perfect every day. You can't build it. You have to build a system for the days that you're not going to do well. Because then on the days that you do well, it's fine. And what I love about what Neil said and a lot of what you're saying is that, okay, you're building in these structures into your lives. You're not putting pressure on yourself to nail it, to crush it every single time. You're just saying, this is the best time of the day for me. I figured this out through a process of experimentation. And I'm making sure in my schedule that this is open for that number one prioritized whatever task development. And that, of course, could change.
It's really interesting what you're saying because there's a lot of there are a lot of narratives out there that say you should have 10 hours of focus or non-interrupted focus, extended focus. People need to be able to step back and be able to replenish their attentional resources. You can't lift weights all day. You're a fitness expert. You can't lift weights for an extended period of time. You have to rest, right? And then you can replenish or maybe you switch around and do other kinds of exercises. But it's this whole idea, it's a myth that we should have extended periods of focus. And I love this idea of being able to sit there and not do anything. You have this time committed to be able to write, and it's just fine to sit there because ideas can incubate in our minds. And we may think we're doing nothing, but there's actually a lot going on. And before you know it, when you actually start writing, be surprised of the clarity that comes from having these ideas incubate in the back of your mind.
I find that when my mind starts to wander, when the tension starts to kind of bubble up and these internal interruptions jump in, I find it's whenever I hit some sort of a snag with whatever I'm working on. It's whenever I hit like the littlest bit of struggle that pauses me for a second. Is there any techniques there to just, it's okay to look up and let your mind wander for a minute? I mean, anything that you found?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, it turns out that going outside in nature is one of the best ways that can help us solve these hard problems. So
tell me more about this.
Yeah.
I like this.
So and this is what research shows that a 20-minute walk in nature can de-stress people. And we did a study where we had people walk 20 minutes in nature. And it turns out when they came back, they scored much higher in what's called divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is like brainstorming. And they were
Okay.
much better at brainstorming compared to days when they didn't have those walks in nature and compared to other people who didn't have that experience. So, there's something about nature that refreshes us. It's stimulating. It allows the mind to calm down, and it helps us perform better.
You talk about your experience working in Germany before the United States.
Yeah.
And it's funny because there was, I don't know whether it happened today or not, but I just saw an announcement today where the Zoom, like the company that does the video conferencing, has now mandated that all of its workers go back to in-office work and they don't meet on Zoom. So it's funny because you talk about the difference then in when you were working in Germany versus how a lot of people work now, where they have digital phone calls, and one of the big things is you don't walk to the water cooler. You don't have those little even 5-minute breathers between meetings. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems to me it doesn't even have to be in nature, does it? Like, how damaging is that? That we just go from call to call to call to call to call because we just flip on different rooms. We don't even have that walk down the hall to the different conference room anymore.
That's right. That's right. So we have these Zoom meetings scheduled back to back. You end one meeting, start a new meeting, and there's no transition time. There's also, like you pointed out, the water cooler time, right? We don't have this time before a meeting to have chit chat with other people in the room, and people talk about their what they did the night before, the shows they watched, or just it's a way to get to know people and break the ice. And what's ironic
Yeah.
is that on Zoom, some managers do this, but you have to formally schedule these kinds of social meetings.
Yeah.
Or during the pandemic, when I taught classes, or I had meetings with my students, I would always start the meetings by doing a check-in, and everyone talked about what's new, what they had fun doing, and we had to formally schedule that, and it's not the same as
Yeah.
spontaneous interaction. And so as a result, in our Zoom world, we're missing out on a lot of things.
It almost seems to me so the book that I'm working on right now with our wonderful agent is called The Obvious Choice. So it's the same name as this summit. And the second lesson, it's 13 lessons. And the second lesson is technology changes, humans don't. And the end of it, I make a call for what I call strategic inefficiency. It almost seems like the pendulum was swinging so far towards be more efficient, leverage technology, be more efficient. It almost seems like the competitive advantage now in a lot of ways is how can we actually build in inefficiencies? Because humans are, I mean, we're just inefficient animals. like generally, physically, mentally, that's a lot of our strengths is that we are not optimized in terms of efficiency. It almost seems like the real clarity comes from this idea of, hey, can we actually build in inefficient times in our days to mental respite? You said, the rote tasks you mentioned. Is there anything else that you can think of that, if you agree with this, if you don't agree with this,
Yeah,
that's totally
no,
cool too.
it's
Maybe I'll change
it's
the book, but
no, it's very intriguing. Can you say more about what you mean by inefficiency?
well, this section of the book is how can we compete in a world where computers and technology and artificial intelligence is going to be able to learn faster and also learn anything that's easy to learn and operate more efficiently and more effectively than us. I mean, even the most advanced single body of knowledge is really easy to teach a computer. Any logical connection between things is really easy to teach a computer. What a human does, and what I think the real value is going to be created, is this weird, well, I give two, but the unmeasurable bit of it is this really beautiful collection of experiences where you have no way that you could possibly measure it or even work backwards and saying, how did that turn into that, turn into that? How did that make me think of this? And it's like, oh, I went on this trip 10 years ago, and then I read this book 8 years ago, and then I had this interview with somebody else 4 years ago. And now I read this thing and it all meshed together in some weird new way that helps me solve this problem uniquely. It's not efficient. It can't be measured. It can't even really be taught. And then the second element of it is a call for what I'm calling so far in the book. I mean, this might change, but future skills, which are empathy, presentation skills, a lot of communication skills. I mean, a lot of what we're going to be is the conduits between the computer and the human. But that's what I mean about this idea of, I guess, strategic inefficiency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, as you know, the AI debate has different sides, and you're taking up one of those sides, which is the idea that AI it's very good at handling data and facts, and it's not great at doing what humans are really good at. And so you're arguing on that side, which is saying, humans have experiences that they can share, whereas AI is, at least the current, like Chat GPT, is only able to use
Right.
the information that's already out there and to combine it and restructure it and synthesize it and present it back. And so, yes, I do agree with you that, humans are able to do things that AI can't, and we absolutely need to value that information. And so the doomsday scenarios of AI is that, people's experiences will be disregarded. But I agree with you. I don't think so. I think that people's experiences will continue to be valued, and I don't think that AI is going to infringe on our opportunities to share experiences.
I'm happy you say that. With all your experience with Microsoft and the technology companies, and I mean, all of your leading researcher in this interaction. You talk about two central ideas from social science. You talk about Dunbar's number, and then you talk about Granovetter's strength of weak ties. And I found that really interesting because they kind of seem to be contradictory in some way. I mean, Dunbar's number argues for tight communities and living in tight communities and the value in that, whereas Granovetter's strength of weak ties argues for how many loose connections can you maintain and how much luck is that going to result in. Are you able, just from a purely selfishly standpoint, I'd love to hear you kind of explain your insight into both of those ideas and the benefits of them. I mean, how we can apply these things in call it our new world. I don't know what to call this world we're in right now.
Yeah. So Dunbar's number, it's really interesting. He found that he's a sociologist, and he found that there are a certain number of social connections that people can have, and think of it as concentric circles. The closest most meaningful connections we can have with people, the number is very small. It's about 5. So think of that as
Yeah.
like this inner circle of 5 people who you can have really close, meaningful relationships with. Then there's a circle around it of people who you can think of as they're friends, but they're not really your closest friends. And that's a large
Like neighbors, like that type of thing. Yeah.
yeah, colleagues or people you might go hang out at a
Yeah.
bar with. And then, of course, there's a wider circle beyond that of like all the people you might know. And they may not be people you would go out to eat with, but they're people you would say hello to or you might exchange an email with. So, first of all, it
Hmm.
turns out that Dunbar's number applies to social media. So he had studied this for in-person interactions. Turns out it applies in social media that
Right.
you really can only have a very small number of people with a real meaningful relationship that you can maintain on social media. You can have a broader number of people that you interact with, but they're not really close connections.
Right.
So, so Dunbar's number is really interesting because a lot of people think that with social media we can develop new relationships and have meaningful relationships.
Nice.
That's not what social media can do. And it turns out that it's good at maintaining relationships. It's not good at really
Hmm.
developing things from scratch. That's,
Interesting.
there's this
Interesting.
phrase, trust needs touch. Like you really need to have in-person contact with someone before you can, really get to having something meaningful with. Now, the strength of weak ties, this is also really interesting because Granovetter, he was also a sociologist, he found that people get benefits like finding jobs. You don't necessarily get that from
Yeah.
a close connection, but you get it from a weaker connection. So your
Yeah.
uncle may not be able to get you the job, but your uncle's friend, your uncle talks within his circle of acquaintances and someone who he knows of a job, and that's where you get your job from. So that's what he means by the strength of weak ties. So your connection to your uncle's friend, maybe you might have met this person, but there's like 2 degrees of separation, but you get your job
Yeah.
from these weak connections.
Yeah. Somebody who you know that went to school with somebody else you know that had dinner with somebody's parent who has a friend who, whatever. it's is
Yeah.
it, but I find the intersection between those two to be so fascinating. I've never thought about it the way that you said. Well, this trust meets touch. I wrote that down the second you said it, but
Hmm.
it starts with tighter, closer connections. But the tighter, closer connections often aren't what actually result in you getting that customer, you getting that job, you finding that perfect staff member, or whatever you're trying to accomplish whenever you put something out there.
I mean, we
There
have
was
a
a
limit.
war.
We have,
Go on.
we have a limited number of connections, and those people within our limited connection circle may not have a job for us. But each of those people have their own circles of connections, and so chances are,
Hmm.
someone somewhere might just find you that job.
Might know. This is the way that I love looking at social media. There's he's actually participating in this event too. His name was Rory Sutherland, and so he's the vice chairman of Ogilvy. But he's been one of the leaders pushing forth behavior change in advertising. And one of the things that he said is Facebook is about nothing if it isn't about serendipity.
Hmm.
And I thought that that was so eloquently put, very Britishly put too, but very eloquently put, where it's true, it's about serendipity, as opposed to trying to use social media and saying, I'm trying to get customers now, I'm trying to get this outcome now. What can I do on social media today to achieve this short term goal? Where really what we're talking about here with Dunbar's number, with strength of ties, is it's not really about that, is it? It's about leveraging the long term of this. I want to talk about, we don't have a ton of time left, and I really wanted to hit on this one point. I want to read a quote from your book, if that's okay. And this is where you talk about the identity trap. And so I'm going to read this quote. You say, for some, careers are built on being an influencer where identity is paramount. Because online identity is so valuable, some individuals can spend a lot of time crafting and refining their posts and profiles, but this can take precedence over goal-directed attention to work or studies. I cut out a little bit and condensed the quote. There's some content in the middle there in the book, but talk to me about that. The minute that I read that, I started just fist pumping in the air. It seemed to really nail down the problem of why people are using social media as much as they are, but also how it's actually often distracting and damaging the very reason why they say they're using it, which is their desired outcome. I want to build a business. I want to achieve this thing.
Yeah. So on social media, you can be however you craft yourself to be, right? You can create your persona the way you want others to see you. In real life, maybe you work at Target, maybe, you don't find your life to be so exciting. But, on social media, give the example of this guy who mixed paint. He worked in a paint store, and he mixed paint, and he became a sensation on social media, and had.
What did he do that was different about mixing paint? Because I like that example in the book, but what was so special about what he did mixing paint that
He,
took off?
yeah, so first of all, I think it was just that mixing paint, it's unusual. People don't usually think about mixing paint. A lot of people use paint, right? It's something a lot of people at some point have a need to paint their house and he
Right.
just came up with unusual colors. And I think it was just, who knows, why did kittens on treadmills become popular on the internet, right? Who knows? It just went viral.
I can tell you when that started. Cats were famous far before the internet. Cats went viral far before the internet. You know who the first person to make cats go viral were?
No?
Henri Pointer, the famous French photographer.
Okay.
He took pictures of cats doing funny things and created postcards of them. And they went viral in 19th century France. Humans don't change, I guess. Getting back to this idea of the identity trap, though.
Yeah.
It's always a funny precedent. So going back to this idea of the identity trap, you started speaking about this guy who was mixing paint.
Yeah.
And that was his day job, was working at a paint store.
So people can be very invested in their online identity because, the internet gives people the freedom and the opportunity to create the persona that you want others to see you as. And this takes time and effort to maintain that persona. And, of course, everyone wants the reward of followers and of being an influencer. And so it takes time to be able to get to that point where you can, be the person who you really want to be, when in fact in real life that may not be a reflection of a lot of things about you. So I think it's this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the internet for a lot of people, it's a dream, right? It's this dream to be who you want to be, to show others who you want to be, and that's why it can be very all encompassing for your time and take away from the goal of what you might need to do for the task at hand.
Or even the proposed reason for using the internet. It might even take away from that. Well, Gloria, this was awesome to talk to you and to get a little bit more background and depth into what I had already read. And here, I'll give it a plug because I got it behind me. Into your wonderful book, Attention Span, which I recommend everybody definitely check out. But this was so much fun for me. And like I said, I've already benefited from your work on maintaining focus, on task switching, on figuring out how to schedule in those kind of rote tasks or constraints over the course of my day that help me kind of get into attention when I need to, get out of it to almost recover so that I can get back into it again. So thank you so much, Gloria. Really, really appreciate you. This is wonderful.
It was my pleasure to be here, and I want to say the main message that I'm trying to convey with the book is the idea that let's put our well-being first. And, instead of striving to be productive and getting ourselves exhausted, let's instead think about using tech in a way that we can maintain our well-being. So thank you so much for having me.
I love it. Thank you.